everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go a little bit more into the idea of bread baskets and comparing it to what we learned about in our last video, discussing the idea of how plants migrated from one area to another. When we first took a look at the areas that they talked about that were the primary starting points for agrarian cultures, they mentioned far from being modern breadbaskets, they include areas ranking today as somewhat dry or ecologically degraded: Iraq and Iran, Mexico, the Andes, part of China, and Africa's shale zone. Here's the map that we took a look at, and some of these areas, here's the shale zone, Ethiopia, Andes. These are not necessarily areas that we think of when we're talking about modern bread baskets. So one of the things I wanted to go over today is actually take a look at more modern bread baskets and see the differences that we see today versus what was originally seen as the starting points for food production in the world. This is from World Atlas, going over the 6 different bread baskets of the world. We have the Central Black region, the region found in central Russia, rich soil known as Black Earth. The soil is rich in high humus percentage and other soil enriching nutrients like ammonia and phosphorus. There are also areas that are not necessarily mentioned. For instance, the Ukraine has a higher level of food production than the rest of the world. In fact, when they are producing and exporting, they actually constitute a fair amount of what's eaten in Europe. Southeast Asia. This region is formed by 10 nations together. They form the ASEAN, meaning Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Out of the top 10 producing countries in the world, the region claims 5. In 2016, they exported 16 tons of rice, constituting 33 of global exports. We're talking a ton of food that is consumed regularly. Canadian prairies. Canadian prairies make up of Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan provinces are very important to the world due to their grain production. Each of these areas focus on a particular type of carbohydrate. With Southeast Asia, we're talking rice. When we're talking Europe and America, we're talking more grains. The prairies export a lot of agricultural food products that other nations around the world. China is another one. Their primary food is rice. San Juan Valley. This is in California. The state of California is an important entity in total agricultural produce in the United States. It accounts for 12.8% of the country's agricultural yield. This is a huge amount of food when we're thinking about the totality of how much space that America has. We're talking a very small area, but they constitute such a vast amount of the food that is produced in the United States. The country has the singular producer of almonds in the United States and worldwide, and the production constitutes 70% of the total almond yield and supply. Grapes is another crop that's known for California. A lot of tropical fruits and veggies come from these areas. Brazil has increasingly grown in importance as the breadbasket of the world, exporting 5 of the world's major crops. The country has 2 main agricultural regions. There is the southern region, which is more fertile with higher rainfall, and the drier eastern region. The former produces a big percentage of the nation's grains, oil seeds, and export crops, while the latter produces coca and tropical plants. These are things that we need to keep in mind is when we're creating our worlds. Not every area is going to have the same impact in how the world plays out. For instance, specific regions have a more specific soil makeup that allows for better crops of a specific type to grow. For instance, we find that the tobacco plant produces a very distinctive taste when it's grown in specific areas, particularly Cuba. Cuba is known as one of the greatest places to grow tobacco, which is where we get Cuban cigars. When we're talking the different types of foods and how they're able to survive in different climate environments, we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about our world. Here, we can see a plant hardiness zone map for the United States. Here, people can take a look and see how plants will survive in their given regions. So for instance, if we take a look at the north here, this is where the area actually becomes almost uninhabitable. So when you see areas like this is areas where you're going to have sparse vegetation. The further north you go, the more hardy the plants have to be in order to survive. Whereas places a lot further south, depending on other factors such as how dry, how much rain it gets, what type of rain, are there seasonal storms? These are all factors when it comes to how fertile an area is. So for instance, during the Civil War, the North was known as industrial because they had a lot more mountainous regions, therefore it made it less sense for planting crops, whereas the South was known for having more canals. This is one of the things that caused problems closer to the wars, is that the North wanted to invest a lot more money into trains and such, whereas in the South, canals, which are a water-based transportation system, were plenty all over the South. This meant not only could they move crops and products along those canals, but at the same time, this allowed areas to stay wetter for longer periods, which meant better chances of higher yields for crops. One of the downsides is that these areas actually became so overabundant with crops that they started planting cash crops, particularly when we're talking about tobacco and cotton. As what ends up happening is that you have certain crops that are known for making money rather than producing food. This causes problems when you can't get the food that you need to provide, and a cataclysmic event takes place to disrupt the food supply. Now, another downside for having an overabundance of crop is that, as we understand with economics, supply has to equal demand. If the demand is very low, then the supply has to also be very low. But if the supply outstrips the demand, the price drops, which means that farmers who produce a lot of crops will end up having to waste their crops. A lot of their crops will actually get destroyed, because what ends up happening is that it becomes uneconomical for them to keep their whole crop, because if you have 2 bushels of corn and they both cost $25, if you burn one, the other one jumps to $60. That's kind of how it works, is that when we're talking about the economics of agrarian cultures, this is not just a make food for myself and tomorrow. This is make food so I can sell, so I can provide for my family in other ways. I don't have the skills to do it. Particularly when we're talking about issues such as plows and cows and other things that farmers couldn't make for themselves. Now, as technology improved, so did the tools to create farming equipment. What we see today is that we are able to concentrate the type of food that we are making into very small areas. So a plot of land that 300 years ago would barely able to provide food for a couple dozen people for a year, now could provide food for hundreds. And because we are able to use things like fertilizer, we're able to allow for higher yields for what we're looking to do. In addition, we also have technologies that we've learned over the course of time, such as crop rotation. This is one of the things that we learned later on, but we found truth earlier. So for instance, there's a story about the Pilgrims and how the Pilgrims were taught by the local native population to mix some of their products. So for instance, they would say that you would put in not just corn, but you would also plant beans in addition to that. What they didn't realize at the time is that the beans actually put nitrogen into the ground for the corn to grow up better. Just like the beans provided something for the corn provided a structure that the beans could grow up off of. By mixing these two, this early way for the people in America to actually produce food for themselves. So when it comes to our stories, how are we able to create worlds where they are struggling not only with the areas? So if you have, say, a ship, whether it is a spaceship, whether it is a boat, whether it is a airplane or anything else, how does the area affect how they're able to produce food for themselves? So say you have a situation where you have a group of individuals lost in an area where there's not much population. Are they going to survive off of food that they have to capture and kill? Are they going to try and start to develop agrarian food production? Are they looking to escape? These are all factors that you can add to your story that can add a level of complexity, and with that complexity, if it's done right, a level of connection with our readers. These are all things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about agrarian cultures and how temperate zones and how different areas provide better or less beneficial soil for producing foods. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comments below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.